Okay, we're going to move on to a seascape now. For the seascape, I have several reference photos that I'd like to combine, so it's going to be really important to make a rough sketch. So I'd like to use this for the basic background, with this gull in the foreground, these gulls in the water, some of these puffy plants in the foreground, and some of the colors of this sea. So to make my rough sketch, I'm going to start with the horizon line. Make sure that the horizon line is not in the center of the page. Then I'll paste my foreground, and then between the sky and the foreground you have the crashing wave. Here's a broken pattern of foliage and trees. Behind that the mountains are going to be lighter. Here's the water lapping up onto the shore. Here's the wave crashing. For placing the bird, I'm going to work with the biggest shapes. Just his round head and body. And he comes down like this. He has a tail that sticks up. He has an eye. And then an indication of some of these puffy plants. And I also like this flying bird here flying over the shore. In the foreground, I'll have some sticks and twigs laying down. There are these cliff edges and then this fence by the sand. Cool. Okay, then add a little bit of tone. And adding the tone will help me see what shapes are lying on which plane. So I'll start with this dark stand of trees. All of this sand is fairly light. And I can blend it gently with my finger. Quickly get an indication there. And here's this foreground seagull, looking very grumpy indeed. And a little bit of color in the water here. Last but not least, I want those gulls that are flying in the air to give a better sense of. So what I'm going to move on to next is transferring the drawing to the stretched watercolor paper. And then I will come back to it when I'm ready to start painting. When you have everything drawn on your paper, and it looks fabulous, and the biscuit is dried, then you're ready to start painting. Alright, now this is my palette when it's ready to go. And there's enough paint in there so that the color doesn't look faded out. It will stick to my finger. Then I'm going to brush on some water in the sky. And remember, no matter what you're painting, always mix in some different colors for variation. And with a wet-on-wet coat like this is kind of making a natural, interesting cloud formation that works really well for the sky. That might be enough. So if it is, I'm going to let it dry, come back to it, and we'll move down. Okay, the sky is dry, so I'm going to move on down the line. So I'm going to mix up a gray and just lay down that far distant indication. And to wash that line down, I'll just wet my brush and of course touch into it with some different colors that can bleed down, and then you're at a place to let it dry again. Alright, that's dry, so I'm going to add this more delicate tree line in here. Put it in with a flat brush and go right over the sky. And when you've put down some color, you can scratch into it with the handle of the brush and make those delicate details of the treetops. Don't forget to add some different colors. Darken it up in places. So then to help that to wash down into fog, I'm just going to get a wet paintbrush and brush on the downside like this. So I'm going to let this dry completely, and then we'll come back to it again. Now I'm going to lay in the sand here. Work with some lighter colors for the top. And I'll soften the lower line by washing in with a wet brush. And all of this is going to be connected with the sand color. So for the sand, I'm going to use my spray bottle and get the surface nice and wet and lay it in nice and heavy. just like this. Soup. I'll pluck out some of these harder ridges now that this is getting a little bit more dry. So now I'm going to let this dry another time. Okay, we're going to work on the water here. So wet the area that you want the water to go in. Just mixing up a puddle of some blues. And I'm going to do a lot of back and forth rotating to get the water active. So spray, and then get your syringe. I like to use a blunt tip syringe and play with water and paint directly on the paper. It's just like this. And throw in some different colors to make it more interesting as well. So then tilt the board and start painting in some of those wave shapes. If you make a mistake, blot the area with your paper towel and just try again. The paper is still just a little bit damp, so it's holding the color pretty well. And I'm going to a little bit more carefully this time paint around the shape of the wave. Alright, so you want some texture variation, you want some color variation, you want some contrast variation. Okay, so I'll let this dry and I'll come back to it in a few minutes. This is dry now, so I'm going to remove that biscuit. Okay, then you need to get to work softening those edges. So I'm just going to get it damp, squeegee off the excess water with my fingers, and then rub over the paper where I want to lighten. So I'm going to do this tedious softening and blending off camera to spare you, and then I will come back to it when we're ready to move on to the foreground. Now I want the foreground to have more color than it does in the reference material, and I'm going to mask off the rest of the painting because I want to do this with a looser approach. So instead of painting it on traditional way, I'm going to spray and have some fun with it. Spray on a green and a darker. Nice. Then I'm going to scrape through with a brush handle and create some of these interesting patterns in the grass. Maybe I'll stamp a bit too. Stamping it using a piece of mat board here. Then take off your paper and see how the color looks. A little bit of it got away from me here. Zoop, 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 zoop. And then I can tilt the board and get some of that soupy stuff worked around, and then it will bleed up into the texture that I'm scraping. Alright, so let's just let that dry and come back to it. Okay, it's dry again, bone dry, and I want to take that biscuit off before we go too much further. Remember, you want to get that off as soon as possible because the longer you wait, the harder it is to blend those harsh edges into the rest of the painting. Alright, I feel as though that seagull's been waiting his turn very patiently, so let's give him a little bit of life here. I'm going to use a flat brush and wash over his white feathers. I want the tone to be subtle and to make a clean gradation. And go not quite to the edge so that he has a little bit of reflected light. Remember the importance of washing in with multiple colors. Get at least some shading all over. And then I'm going to squeegee off my brush and blend that tone a little bit. Okay, while he's drying, I'll paint some detail on this fellow right here. I don't want it to blend into the sand too much, so I have to work to keep those two tones separate. And then when that is all completely dry, I can go in and darken some details. But that's a good starting place for him. Then I'll jump back to the foreground and do some work on these plants. So the yellow is easy. I'm just going to use a round brush and drop in some yellow dots. Very, very easy. And then for those puffy white things, I'm just going to add a little bit of gray on the underside of each one to make them look a little bit more three-dimensional. I think those feathers are dry enough though that I can add the gray to the seagull. And use your flat and make a nice clean edge. So you're working from the large shapes to the smaller details. And of course he needs a beak, so let's mix up some orange. And again, even in this small orange beak, I need multiple colors. So I put it down as one color, and then I pop into the top here with some yellow to let that bleed down. I'll also have to add an eye, but the character in his face really comes from the shadow right over the eye, so I want to get that in there. He looks so grumpy, it's hilarious. So there he is, grumping around. So now all the main elements are in place. Obviously I'll have to do some refining, but what I'm going to work on off camera are these time-consuming details in the foreground elements, and then I'll come back to it. Okay, I've done a little bit more work in the details here in the foreground. I'm going to add some more detail to this bird in flight. I'm just going to quickly indicate a few things. Remember, you don't want to overdo it on the detail. Just give a quick glance and then look away or even cover the picture. Then just fill in the details that you remember from that quick look. And that will give you a better indication of where the large shadow shapes are, because you only want to emphasize the large shapes. Your picture will be more powerful, and the shapes will work better if you focus on the large shapes and leave the details to the eye to fill in. Alright, that might be all that I want to do with him. I need to add these pilings. I'm going to use my 1/2 inch flat with some brown on it, and then just quickly place those pilings. So for the closest pilings, I'll re-emphasize the darkness, and huzzah! That's it. I need to emphasize the under edge of the cliff up here, but just a little bit. I really like the way that it bleeds off into nothing there, so I want to leave it alone. And I need to add some grass to give us some ground behind the cliff. Lovely. Okay. Now with a small round brush, I'm going to add those birds in the sky. Then another darker color for emphasis, just a touch in here and there. All that really remains is to give it a little bit of time and do some more work polishing up the foreground details. But to do those isn't going to employ any new techniques that we haven't covered. So I'm going to do those final elements off camera, and then I'll come back one last time and show you the final painting. Alright, here's what I've come up with so far. So you have a sense of movement in the sea and in the flight of the birds that contrasts nicely to the straight lines of the solid earth in the foreground and in the background. So I think that altogether the painting works pretty well. So that's where I'm going to leave it for this month's tutorial on how to paint a seascape. I hope that you've come away with some lessons that you can take to your own studio, and I hope that you'll join me again next month for another drawing and painting tutorial. Thanks so much for watching.